In 1940, the United States was not at war with anyone, but the FCC had just ordered all 51,000 licensed amateur radio operators in the country to submit fingerprints and proof of citizenship to the federal government. These were hobbyists, people who built transmitters in garages and basements and talked to strangers over the radio for fun. What none of them could have known was that the federal government had been building toward this moment for almost 30 years, and that within 2 it would absorb tens of thousands of them into the largest military mobilization in American history. 30 years before the government started collecting amateur radio operators' fingerprints, it barely knew they existed. In April 1912, the RMS Titanic went down in the North Atlantic, and one of the loudest complaints in the aftermath was about radio interference. Amateur operators on shore were accused of jamming distress frequencies, clogging the airwaves with hobby chatter while passengers drowned in freezing water. Whether those accusations were entirely fair didn't matter to Congress. It responded with the Radio Act of 1912, the first federal law requiring amateur radio operators to carry a government-issued license. Overnight, the amateurs went from anonymous tinkerers to a documented, regulated community with their names and addresses on file in Washington. 2 years later, on April 6, 1914, a radio engineer named Hiram Percy Maxim and his colleague Clarence D. Tuska co-founded the American Radio Relay League in Hartford, Connecticut. The ARRL organized networks of amateur stations that could relay messages across distances no single transmitter could reach on its own, leapfrogging signals from one operator to the next across the country. And by the time the ARRL got off the ground, there were already thousands of licensed operators scattered nationwide. People who'd taught themselves radio engineering, built their own equipment from surplus parts and mail-order catalogs, and developed real technical proficiency without any formal military training whatsoever. Nobody in the federal government was thinking about war when those licenses started going out, but the United States had just accidentally assembled a reserve of trained radio operators years before it would realize it needed one. That realization came fast. When the U.S. declared war in April 1917, the government shut amateur radio down completely. Every private station in the country was either closed or physically disassembled, and it stayed illegal for any civilian to operate a transmitter until amateur privileges were restored in November 1919, more than a year after the armistice. But the government had no intention of letting that expertise go to waste. The Navy created a Class 4 Naval Reserve program specifically for amateur operators who could pass a physical exam and send and receive Morse code at 10 words per minute. Thousands of amateurs enlisted as military radio operators during the war, filling communications billets the existing ranks simply couldn't staff fast enough on their own. And this is where the pattern first became visible, the pattern that would repeat itself for the next 3 decades. The government would silence amateur radio during a crisis, then turn around and recruit those same silenced operators into the military communications infrastructure it desperately needed to function. After the war ended, amateur radio came roaring back to life, and the domestic community kept expanding. But the people paying the closest attention to what had just happened with the Navy were U.S. Army officers. In November 1925, Captain Thomas C. Rives of the Army Signal Corps created the Army Amateur Radio System, the AARS. Its mission was twofold: build a standing pool of trained operators who could reinforce the Signal Corps during the next wartime mobilization, and extend the military's radio network for civilian disaster response during peacetime. A later Army historical monograph acknowledged that despite this early start, AARS membership remained modest through the interwar years and was, in the monograph's own phrasing, significantly underdeveloped in numbers by the time the United States entered World War II. In hindsight, the government's approach to closing that gap would turn out to be far more aggressive than anyone in the amateur radio community expected. By June 1940, war in Europe had been raging for almost a year, and the crackdown on amateur radio was already well underway. First, the FCC banned all international contacts for the country's licensed operators. 4 months later came the fingerprinting and citizenship requirement, which meant that by the end of 1940, the federal government had a name, an address, and a full set of prints for every single licensed amateur radio operator in the United States. This wasn't routine bureaucratic housekeeping. The government had built a complete registry of every trained civilian radio operator in the country, while the United States was still officially neutral. That same year, President Roosevelt approved a $1.6 million emergency fund for a new National Defense Operations section inside the FCC, and the man chosen to lead it was George E. Sterling, himself a licensed ham radio operator. Sterling searched government license files, identified operators with the technical skills he needed, and sent them telegrams offering positions. The unit he assembled would soon be reorganized and renamed the Radio Intelligence Division, the RID. The RID didn't wait for war to be officially declared. It built primary monitoring stations in Texas, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, all before the United States had formally entered the conflict. One retrospective technical account estimated that roughly 80% of the RID's workforce were current or former amateur radio operators, a figure from a single source that should be taken as a well-informed estimate rather than a confirmed statistic, but one that speaks to how deeply amateurs had been embedded in the operation. By December 1941, the United States had a functioning radio intelligence network staffed substantially by recruited hobbyists, trained and operational, before a single bomb fell on American soil. The full-scale test came on December 7th. The day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the FCC issued Order Number 87, immediately suspending all amateur radio operations across the entire United States. Every ham transmitter in the country went dark overnight, but the RID went to work. 2 days after Pearl Harbor, one of those listening posts, staffed by the very same operators George Sterling had pulled from government license files, detected a suspicious radio signal broadcasting from within Washington, D.C. Direction-finding stations across the country triangulated the source within minutes, and the following day, RID investigators traced the transmitter directly to the German embassy. That finding was independently corroborated by a separate historical account of the FCC's wartime monitoring operations. Over the following years, the RID went on to locate clandestine Axis transmitters across the entire Western Hemisphere, working alongside the FBI and cooperating with Latin American governments to track down covert enemy radio networks. While the intelligence side was hunting enemy transmitters, amateur radio was being reorganized for civil defense on the home front. In June 1942, at the ARRL's direct urging, the FCC created the War Emergency Radio Service, WERS. Unlike previous amateur programs, WERS issued community-based licenses, allowing organized local groups to operate on 112 MHz for air raid warning communications and disaster response. Thousands of amateur stations participated through the duration of the war, and the military itself was absorbing amateur operators into its active duty ranks at a scale that made World War I look like a pilot program. Tens of thousands of licensed amateurs served in the armed forces, many assigned directly to the Army Signal Corps and Navy communications branches. The total amateur population going into the conflict was roughly 60,000 licensees, which means a very large fraction of the entire community ended up in uniform. That same amateur skill set was also fueling wartime innovation far from the front lines. Al Gross earned his amateur radio license, call sign W8PAL, at just 16 years old, and as an engineering student in the late 1930s, built an early handheld two-way radio he referred to as a walkie-talkie. During World War II, Gross was recruited by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, to work on the Joan Eleanor system, a covert air-to-ground communications link that allowed intelligence agents behind enemy lines in occupied Europe to communicate with aircraft overhead using a narrow, hard-to-intercept directional beam. Credit for the walkie-talkie is genuinely contested among historians, with Canadian inventor Donald Hings and Motorola's wartime engineering team also recognized for early portable radio development. What isn't contested is that Al Gross took the skills he developed as a teenage ham and applied them to some of the most sensitive intelligence technology of the war. The fighting ended in 1945, but the cycle had made one thing clear to military planners. The United States needed a permanent system for activating amateur operators during a national emergency, one that wouldn't require months of setup time before it became operational. The AARS was reactivated in 1946, renamed Military Amateur Radio in 1948, and renamed again to the Military Affiliate Radio System in 1952, the direct lineage that continues operating today as MARS. And because building WERS from scratch after Pearl Harbor had taken roughly 6 months, the ARRL and the Army's Office of Civil Defense created the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, RACES, in 1952, designed for rapid activation whenever a president needed to silence amateur radio while simultaneously needing those same operators on designated emergency frequencies. Every one of those post-war programs exists because of what happened between 1912 and 1945. A hobby that started with people wiring together homemade transmitters in their spare time produced the trained operators, the intelligence personnel, and the communications backbone that the most powerful military on the planet could not have assembled fast enough on its own. That pattern didn't happen because the government planned it from the beginning. It happened because thousands of civilians independently chose to learn a difficult technical skill for no reason other than curiosity. And when the crisis came, that knowledge turned out to be exactly what the country needed most.